Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rudolph Clay, Head of Library Diversity Initiatives and Outreach Services. Welcome to the Washington University Library's Faculty Book Talk series for the spring 2021 semester. We are very excited to have you with us, and we're very excited to have today's speaker. Professor Sowande Mustakeem received a bachelor's degree from Elon College, a Master's of Arts degree in African and African American Studies from The Ohio State University, and a PhD in Comparative Black History from Michigan State University. Here at Washington University, she is Professor of History and Professor of African and African American Studies. In 2017, she became the first African American tenured through the tenure track process in the history department here at Washington University. Some of her research interests include Atlantic world slavery, Black women's history, gender, violence, and the social history of medicine. Courses that Professor Mustakeem has taught include Terror and Violence in the Black Atlantic, Slavery and Memory in American Popular Culture, Medicine, Healing, and Experimentation in the Contours of Black History, and Mapping the World of Black Criminality. Professor Mustakeem published numerous articles and essays related to a wide array of interests, including race, gender, terror, violence, medicine, healing, illness, popular culture, and public memory. Her most recent contribution appeared in the online publication Vox, titled 6 Myths About the History of Black People in America. She has been featured on BBC Radio and was on Henry Louis Gates' PBS documentary series, Many Rivers to Cross. This afternoon, we have the pleasure of having Professor Mustakeem talk about her book, Slavery at Sea, Terror, Sex, Sickness in the Middle Passage, which was published by the University of Illinois Press in 2016. The book has received critical acclaim, winning the 2017 Wesley-Logan Prize, which is jointly awarded by the American Historical Association and the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. The prize is awarded to the best book on history of the African diaspora. In 2020, the Dred Scott Foundation awarded the Dred Scott Freedom Award for historical literary excellence. It has appeared twice on the Washington Post must-reads list. The book and its accompanying soundtrack are now on display in the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. Historian Barbara Krauthammer stated in her review, quote, "This work will shift the way scholars frame the history of slavery in the Americas by extending the terrain of enslavement across the Atlantic and centering the lives and deaths of enslaved African women and men in the Middle Passage," end of quote. We are very happy to have with us this afternoon Professor Sowande Mustakeem to talk about her book, Slavery at Sea, Terror, Sex, and Sickness in the Middle Passage. Please, even though you're doing it virtually, help me welcome Professor Mustakeem. Welcome.
Welcome, thank you. And thank you to everyone here. It is an honor to be here with so many interested at a very interesting time. So again, I want to thank you, Rudolph. I want to thank you, Lauren. I want to thank the entire library as well as for Washington University in my being here. And the title of my talk, as you see, Bloodied Waters, Hidden Histories, Race, Terror, and the Unmaking of Freedom. And I was saying to Rudolph, I hope it was bloody enough. And I warn you that the stories, they won't be uplifting. They will be bloody, they will be very terror-centric, and they will allow us to go into a past that some of us are unwilling to navigate. Most of all, blood. But first of all, I want to start and say, welcome to Black History Month. And I say that because here we are standing in February, right within the middle of one of the most important months for the work that I do and the many people within and across the diaspora who study the experiences of people of African diaspora. So again, I say, welcome to Black History Month, and it is because of Carter G. Woodson, as well as the oldest Black professional historical organization in the world that Carter G. Woodson would found in the middle of a pandemic. Let's go ahead and think about that. But I am coming through that. I am a lifetime member. So it means even more to stand here before you and a great many to talk about some really critical, very critical aspect of Black history. So as I was coming into our conversation today, I was thinking about we stand at such a really critical juncture. Here we are that slavery and race and capitalism and Black bodies and health and a broken health system would all of a sudden matter, as well as water and land and ships. But then who really wants to own a history of slavery? So we stand at a place where we're still questioning the need for history, and then also still questioning the rigor of African and African American studies. And the book that I'm about to talk about, it begins to bring together many worlds. And so again, I welcome all those who are here so we can think even more deeply about where are we going in this conversation? And most of all, we got to look at where did it start? W.E.B. Du Bois in 1896, he wrote his Harvard dissertation on the Atlantic slave trade. And in so doing, 120 years would move forward from his first text, The Suppression of the African Slave Trade, which in producing this, it will be the first book in a long historiography of the slave trade, and of which Slavery at Sea now stands. But as we start, and as I always think about, how do I want to talk about the book? How do I want people to think about it in the future? The first thing that I want us to think about are the icons of slavery. How we tell the past through iconic images and certain stories that we privilege. Because that's where we have to start. That's where I started in thinking about slavery and thinking about the slave trade. So I had to start with a colorful diagram with what a lot of people and what a lot of my students, we talk about. We know the triangular trade and the movement of people and goods and across the Americas, maybe, but what do we know? What do we privilege? Well, we know the tight packing. Well, we know there were so many people, and we know that they had it bad. The so-called slaves had it bad. But who are the so-called slaves? Who are those who were enslaved? What are the narratives that are contained beyond these iconic images? But I gotta go further, because there are many images that permeate in our minds that allow us to, like, we know this history of the slave trade. And this is one of these images that is looking at also overthrow and even suicide and jumping over these iconic images. But even more, my book is moving within and pushing back against this narrative that is centered completely on adult Black males, these muscled men, as the only shipped across the Atlantic, as the archetype for everyone's experiences. But what does it tell us about the many, many people? So in starting with the icons, I'm challenging what we know. And we see here blood. I wanted us to take in another, historical, or this rendition of what is created on the cover, because there is intentionality all throughout the book. It very much is a puzzle for those who want to go really deep, but the blood is where we start. So we can understand terror, sex, and sickness, all of these words that have great and deep meaning, that from the beginning to the end. As you'll see, this table of contents from the beginning to the end, we're thinking about the middle passage in a whole new way. And as you can peruse the entire listing of the chapters, you'll see that I'm moving across time and space and bodies. And from the very beginning, for those who've read it and for those who haven't, and maybe there's still going to be even more in the future, the opening story. How dare I open up with a story of two Black women? So already I'm moving, and I wanted to actually remind us that my book coming out in 2016 means that I stand 120 years from when Du Bois published his first book. But it would take 120 years until we would open up with a story of just Black women, and also beginning to go at what do we know, so that we can extend our deeper lexicon of who we still do not know. And so one of the central arguments that I want us to really, as we are going in, I want us to understand, the real question is, it's written, but what is it that people across the world are being drawn to it? It is the stories, it is how it's written, but it is the central argument that is anchored within the book. And the center point for me, it is very much a telling of racial capitalism that was anchored most prominently on the trading and buying and selling of Black people on the global market, and in these investments in jobs and ships and buildings and building these industries. Through that, I began to really understand the business of slavery. And in so doing, I began to expand. I needed to expand. What is this? Of course, it would really be till the end of it that I understood, wow, look what I did, but then what meaning do we make of it? So I expanded the lexicon for us to think about the human manufacturing system, a slaving industry that spanned 4 centuries. And it was based largely on this business formulaic model: warehousing, transport, and delivery. I think even right now we're thinking about manufacturing in a whole new way. But what does it look like when people are at the center of it? That's what this book is looking at, from the point of capture to the point of sale. It is really looking at the making and the unmaking of people through a violent enterprise that we would know as the transatlantic slave trade. But we must go deeper if we're going to really pull out the terror, the heartbreak, the hardships, the destruction of lives. So throughout the chapters, which we're going to be moving into, I wanted people to understand that there's the breaking down of people, the unmaking of people. And hopefully you all can see it, that not every enslaved person experienced slavery the same way. So there's no way that framing slavery completely around adult Black males would begin to tell me about females or the young or the elderly. So within this first chapter, Waves of Calamity, so we're going to have we'll be moving through images, and I'll be sharing more and reading from the book. But I wanted us to actually take in this image of an ocean, of course, that maybe looks normal without blood, because then we could forget the terror that was enacted across the oceanic waters. But within Waves of Calamity, it is thinking about these ordered desires, merchants and brokers, and demand that is coming from across the Atlantic. So the book itself is centered within the longest legal point within the slave trade, the legal era of the 18th century. So it's not looking at the 19th century that often we will base our knowing of slavery on. If I even go to Amistad, which is in the 19th century. So slavery at sea, and starting within this chapter and all throughout, it is centered very much within the 18th century to look at when slavery became a point, it's an unregulated point of commerce, the movement of ships in between spaces that would contain both the American and the British slave trade. So within this chapter, we're moving through ordered desires. What are the rules of engagement? The inner spaces and outer boundaries. Now we're seeing from point of capture to point of sale. What does slavery look like before even the movement aboard slave ships? But it is the business of slavery that is very much placed within this chapter, where it begins within these coastal deals made between global traders based upon Black bodies. And throughout, it really is trying within this chapter, really by trying to show what became normal within these business deals. So they're in the conversations, the movement of monies, employment of workers, and brokering of deals. They actualize and both actualize and imagine. This is where the beginning of the initial unmaking of Black lives began. And for the many Black people and bond people at the center, this permanent exile that will begin through the slaving industry, it would signal this formative beginning, making and unmaking of enslaved people. But when we think about, again, the people, who are the people? And that was a very important thing for me. When we're thinking about the people and we're thinking about those who've been enslaved, then all of a sudden we've got to look at what I was calling this vast array of human merchandise. If we're talking about the manufacturing of humans, then we got to look at who and what was on display and made merchandise on the African side of the Atlantic. So within this chapter, we're being invited to think about, consider, and remember auctions happened before the Americas. There is the poking, the prodding of Black bodies in these ways. So we're thinking about this wider barometer of enslaved health, but also a very important category for me. As we're thinking about females and males, we got to think about a child is not a woman. A child is not a man. Thinking about babies and toddlers and teenagers and the elderly. So in that way, we're going beyond our normal, they have it all the same. It's not. And yet there will be another category that we often really overlook. The refuse, essentially the throwaway. And there was this one story within chapter 2 where I start, damages committed against repudiated slaves, they were not confined to the African shoreline. So I'm speaking more to the continuity of sales, business deals that are happening on the coast itself. Seaman Henry Ellison explained that one afternoon, a native Black called Captain Lima Lima, he climbed on ship to receive customs for captives previously bought during the vessel's stay. While awaiting payment, he observed, quote, a canoe paddling inshore with 3 people and an old man. So 3 people were in the ship, an old man, a young woman, and a woman. Young man, an older man, and a woman. And he beckoned this small ship over, this dinghy, over to Ellison's ship. Obliging his request, several men led the small boat across the waters, after which 3 captives were placed for sale. The chief made express interest in buying the young male and female because, quote, the other was too old. He immediately refused to buy him, end quote. Upon exclusion, Lima forced the aged man back into the canoe where, quote, his head was laid upon one of the thwarts of the boat and chopped off and immediately thrown overboard, end quote. Decapitation reinforced the extent of relentless power and command that some West African traders sought to create through psychological terror enacted on those in captivity. This power, publicly in view of sailors and slaves and far from indigenous to Africa and Africans, it became replicated through equally gruesome ways, again, within this world of slavery at sea. And so thinking about the refuse, it is really considering we've privileged the narrative of those who made it across, the so-called best of the best, and we've got to be more attentive to who are we leaving left out in the memory? And the refuse are, I would argue, one of the most primary categories. And so from Imagined Bodies, from chapter 2, where we're still on the coast, but now in chapter 3, and I hope that this picture I hope it makes us a little bit uncomfortable. There's nothing comfortable about slavery, because here we need to think about the space of the ship. What are the provisions provided? So it's thinking about confined dangers, the constraint of what I call the constraint of nutrition, exercise, and water, or lack thereof. So throughout this entire chapter is looking at what is and how is the space of the ship become even more conducive to the breaking down of people, to be locked in the hold of a ship, but also thinking about the environmental hazards and catastrophes that would circulate around while awaiting a ship's sail, while waiting and buying others. And this is where the beginning of boarding the ship and its deeper meaning would take place. Now, in moving to chapter 4, this, I would say, is the turning point. This is what I tell people when they say, oh, I'm reading your book and excuse me, and how deep it's taking them. And I always ask, what chapter are you on? Because of course, from beginning to end, we've got blood all throughout. But nonetheless, it is thinking about where is it that you're about to be plunged even deeper is in chapter 4, because this is where I made every attempt to make violence that much more bloody in its meaning. And I knew that many would want ship revolts and they would want to talk about it, as people would say, tell me about how the best rose up. Well, that is not happening here. It is more broadening this conversation of what I do call blood memories. And there are a lot of blood memories. So thinking about violence within the ship, thinking about counter resistance of violence, thinking about the overthrow of children, thinking about where lives are destroyed even more. But within this chapter, I also am thinking about these eruptions of chaos and what we know, and then who we keep within those conversations. And I say that because if you see, even looking at this image, there's not one woman, we can't imagine. So then we're creating the memory that women never fought back or young girls never fought back. When reading from Blood Memories, much like plantation owners, sailors were never, quote, in control as fully as they would have liked, end quote. In 1721, the slaver Robert disembarked from Sierra Leone with 30 purchased slaves. Amid the passage, 5 captives, including a female, planned to overthrow the crew. Now, we may not know how she found means to strategize and understand where and how different tools were located, because she served as a spy, essentially able to determine where these weapons were found in order to, quote, execute the treachery. So by the time of a surprise attack that would happen on this ship, although there were arguably, there were going to be more people, but only a woman and 2 men made up this band of insurgent captives on the Robert. And what would happen, though, is that because of the lower numbers, it would make it easier for sailors to quickly thwart their rebellious insurgents. However, the counter resistance is what is even more central to our understanding of violence and how out in the middle of the ocean, what do people do when no one is looking? How and where and how do we treat or maybe mistreat others? So the ship captain, referred to as Harding, began by enforcing punishment against 2 bondmen who were actively involved. And he ordered several seamen to, quote, whip and scarify them only, end quote. 3 other captives accused of serving as, quote, abettors, but not actors, they were sentenced to death. However, before their execution, to enforce greater dehumanization for their insubordinate actions, they were made to first, quote, eat the heart and liver of one of the sailors that was killed, end quote. The sentence imposed upon the bondwoman was equally as unforgiving as that of her male counterparts. Employing the frequent use of public displays of brutality, she was, quote, hoisted up by the thumbs, whipped and slashed with knives before the other slaves till she died, end quote. Flogged, cut, and murdered in view of the entire ship, the triple punishment enacted on this woman's flesh, it served as a mechanism of reform and deterrence for others. The appearance of wounds and permanent scars on her body, they reinforce how, quote, torture usually mimes the killing of people by inflicting pain, the sensory equivalent of death, substituting prolonged mock execution for execution. And so blood would spill on ships, in the water, all around the water. And then yet when we go beyond, we can never really get beyond the violence itself, but then when we begin to think and remember that we're talking about people who were treated as goods, then we remember that we have a psyche going on. We have emotions, we have feelings. And this book was written to make people feel and remember. In this chapter 5, Battered Bodies and Feeble Minds, I went there into the depths of the mind and the body and the spirit, and how Black bodies are read in every moment at points of resistance, but also that breaking down that is happening. I have a story I want to share with you that keep this never ending. I made sure there were plenty, always under constant surveillance. The morose behaviors of bond people never went unnoticed. Slave trader George Miller shared the case of a female captive brought aboard ship who, quote, refused any sustenance and neither would she speak, end quote. As a result of her insolence, quote, she was at last ordered to have thumb screws put upon her to reinforce this control held over her. Primary intent with this particular device for any captive was, quote, to take the stubbornness out of them, end quote. Twisting her digits and crushing them within the metal object made the bondwoman yell out in agony. Going further, several sailors suspended her body, quote, in the mizzen ringing and used the cat o' nine tails to lash and scar her once valuable flesh. Although, in Miller's view, these strategies operated, quote, all to no purpose, end quote. She suffered from a range of violence and became a public spectacle for the ship. Yet she died 3 or 4 days after carrying out her own designated sentence. And what's important to this particular story is that the questions will circulate on the methods she used to end her life. However, following her death and the subsequent discovery of her lifeless body, Miller reported, quote, I was told by some of the women slaves that she spoke to some of them the night before she died, intimating to her shipmates that, quote, she was going to her friends, end quote. So any violent persuasions used to extract information from the remaining bondwoman, they're unrecounted in the surviving sources. So then we're already seeing this surveillance, this constant intrusion within Black lives. Of course, to be bought and sold, you no longer have freedom. That is gone, that is taken away at every given moment. But yet we are also now being exposed to the operation of, quote, a female network that while crowded together in the darkened hole, they were able to facilitate a code of secrecy that shielded discovery of the bondwoman's efforts, thus permitting the defiant female to follow through with her designated design. And so all throughout the chapter, it is thinking more about, again, the many variations to get us to think about how people cope with the shock of enslavement, because that is where and how it happens. It happens in the mind and the body, and how people chose to live or to move in between realms. Is it jumping overboard? Is it hangings? Is it willing oneself to die? So within that chapter, it is definitely one of the heavier chapters that brought me to a whole other place. But then the anatomy of suffering. We must think about the medical history of slavery at sea. And this chapter solidifies a void. It solidifies a deeper understanding of the worlds of medicine and how professionals, slave ship surgeons, would find a place within this slaving industry on multiple levels. And I want to share a story that always stands out. Close interaction with Black cadavers enabled physicians to both study and practice the seaborne process of health management. One physician described the situation of a, quote, stout man deemed healthy during conducted coastal examinations. And however, once aboard ship, his health took a dramatic turn for the worse. The next morning, crew members found him dead. Baffled by the bondman's death, quote, I had the curiosity to open him, the attending surgeon explained, and he queried the ship captain for approval to conduct an autopsy. And the commander agreed, quote, providing it was done with decency, end quote. Decency was rarely found in the slave trade, once left under the transport and violent preservation of slave ship workers. Fully permitted, the surgeon, quote, opened the thorax and the abdomen and found the respective contents in a healthy state, end quote, leading him to conclude that the man had suffocated while stowed in the ship's bowels. However, during the surgeon's 1790 testimony before the British House of Commons, interviewers questioned him on whether a deadly affliction might have been present in the male slave's brain. Quote, every man that knows anything of anatomy, the physician responded, knows that opening the head in a dexterous manner so as to expose the brain is often no easy thing. And I had neither time nor conveniences in that instance to do it, given the extensive duties required of him. He therefore performed an examination of the man's body, quote, at candlelight upon the deck after all the slaves were below, end quote. Since the crew were expected to manage the concerns of other captives throughout the day, we really won't know how they preserved the bondman for later use, where where they stored his body, the amount of time the surgeon spent cutting open or observing the bondman's interior cavity. And we also don't know what was done with the body and the internal organs at the conclusion of a post-mortem examination. So what I really am doing in placing slave ship surgeons back within this world of slavery and slavery at sea is to really get us to understand these tensions between a world of ship captains, a world of, and also it's introducing fraudulent means of entering the trade. It is opening us to think about, how do you heal? How do you cure someone out within the middle of the ocean while also operating within racialized ideas of the Black body? But more importantly, what we cannot forget is that these professional medical men, that they benefited. They benefited from being involved over and over in whatever ways that they would choose, but it is also off the ship. It is being a part of a profession. It is then beginning to have journal articles, publications, and lectures, and essentially expansion of their professional careers. And so from the anatomy of suffering, where I will say the entire chapter is moving through a range of diseases that we know and we don't, including scurvy, but also thinking about how someone can die from a torn scrotum, but then also how someone can die from an abortion or a miscarriage, just thinking about the body in new ways. But within this last chapter, chapter 7, A Tide of Bodies, it really is getting us to think about now the arrival of who, what, how many, as well as the trauma as well as disability. I will say that more recently, disability and my inclusion in it has taken on a whole new meaning, because I introduce those who arrive missing an eyeball, missing fingers, missing toes, to say and to show how the making and the unmaking was happening violently all throughout this entire process. So when we're even looking at this image, when we saw it was just so many, then now though, we're by the end of that book, by the end of the book, it is being more informed on the who, because this picture still doesn't show all the many types of people that I am centering intentionally throughout the book. But within this tide of bodies, I really am turning our attention to the arrival, but also the violent space of slave sales, of auctions, what we think we know, that they are violent in and of themselves, but then really sort of showing this interlinking of the merchants and the brokers and the buyers in this way. And then essentially, how are we fulfilling demand? So all throughout, it's looking at that. It's looking at the it is looking at the what do I say, the intrusion of the undesirables. So now all of a sudden, what happens when those are being imported that you don't want and you can't send back? So throughout that chapter, it's getting us to feel and understand the trauma and to see it on and off ship. But I will say the epilogue, this is kind of like one of my favorites, if you will. There's no, the favorite is that it's done, it has a spine, an ISBN, and that the world now is able to engage it, because I lived with this history for many, many years. But in so-called ending, I offered what I called to help myself by calling it a meditation on memory, but really thinking about what I call the Frankenstein of slavery. And you'll see that like halfway I had underlined a sentence where to remind us that it's not that we're lacking stories and why this history and these herstories haven't been told. It's that what do we do with a history that exposes humanity at its absolute lowest in all of these different ways? And really what I was trying to do with this chapter, sort of as I'm moving out to say, I gave you the history, but now it's about the meaning that we make of it. And again, as I'm finishing, I know it'll be a surprise for some people, but you see in the opening of the epilogue that I'm quoting from Penny Dreadful. But actually, as I was preparing for this talk, I began to think about pop culture is very big for me, which is why some of those may recognize that 1991 movie, Wes Craven's The People Under the Stairs, because I think I was like junior high or something. But I went and saw that movie and I realized that years earlier, that was in my mind, and I was remembering it as I was writing this book, as I was really getting to the point of memory. So within Penny Dreadful, the way that it really hit me is thinking about Frankenstein and Frankenstein's monster. And I say that because I found that the middle passage is sort of this, what we want to leave, what we want to lock away, put up under the stairs, never bring up. But what happens when we really think about it, as I sort of end and say, that when we look at that the slave ship experience, it really concretely parallels the abdominal and man-like monster comprised of the stitched together parts of the dead and the living, embodied in this impermeable fusion of both the creator, Victor, and the monster, and sort of taking a cue from Mary Shelley's iconic work, Frankenstein. But what I am saying is that essentially this Frankenstein, we think about it, what comes to mind is ugly, it's vile, it's demonic, it's abdominal, get away, I don't want to talk about it no more. But I was arguing that the middle passage is seen in the same way. War, bloodshed, carnage, diseased bodies, uncertainty, nothing that makes you feel good in the history. And so through it, we try to hide it away. We don't want to talk about it. So then it's intentionally unremembered in what I say, the annals of slavery's history, where the middle passage is and continues as we silence it and don't talk about it, then it becomes most representative of the deeper meanings of Frankenstein. So thus I call it the Frankenstein of slavery. But more importantly, this entire book, it is demonstrating that it is not about the destination. That is important in another part of the narrative. It is more about the making and the unmaking through the journey, through that entire process from the point of capture to the point of sale. And as I am so-called ending, I want to point to that in finishing the book, it also allowed me to think about culturally, how do we produce the future in another way? And I moved beyond a whole other level of what I've seen in academia, and that meant to produce a book soundtrack with other musicians. And then as you'll see, all the chapter titles, and you can go find it on Bandcamp. So this is all getting us to think about the future of history making and the cultural productions, thinking about where are the archives, where are the platforms, and because we're under a pandemic, thinking about accessibility. So again, as you'll see, the what I try to do with each track is for it to match what I did in writing the book itself, but it has also opened me up to how you can teach a book as well as teach music and begin to introduce people to a whole other world. So I guess I'll say that I'll begin here. I wanted to really save some time, hopefully there's still time, for question and answers. So yeah, I don't know how time is looking. And Rudolph, if you're still there, then I can either stop to share or we can leave it up. It's up to you. But if you have any questions, then you can send a chat or you can send a message to Rudolph. And so again, whatever time that we have, I'm happy to talk through some questions with people.
Thank you, Professor Mustakeem. This was just fascinating. Yes, if you would, if those that are listening would put their questions in chat, and I will be able to relay those to our speaker. And just to, while people may be doing that now, and I will have a couple of questions. I'm going to take my prerogative as being a librarian, and I want to ask a little bit if you could share with your research process, in that the resources that you utilized and where those were, because I would assume that this really must have taken you all around the world.
It has, and thank you for that. And that really was supposed to be the first thing I started with, to say I went all over the world. You can't imagine that now. But to answer your question, I went to 25 archives across the world. And when I say the world, for me, that was the East Coast, from north to south. That is going to New York, going to Rhode Island, going to North Carolina, South Carolina, as well as going to London and Liverpool and Jamaica, and really looking at where and how can I get to the central question of what was the slave ship experience like? And that really took me to archives, and also went to medical libraries. I love medical libraries. But I love archives. I'm definitely an archive lover, but it is also appreciation of the public library. So right now I have to say that, I missed the library. I really wish that I could be perusing the books, because for those who have the book or those who are going to get it, then you'll see that's a very extensive bibliography that I mine the sources and really looking at the construction of this history, what we know, and then thinking even more about it. So the process for me really was being open, having this, what I felt was a broad question, and going in and being open to new experiences, to be able to read the body, to be able to read behaviors in new ways, and then to bring it all together. As I say, the book is a puzzle. You could read it from the beginning to the end, or I even tell some people, if you want to go even deeper, then you should start with the epilogue and then start all over, and then you'll get a whole other read in another way that sort of matches the process. Is trying to really show, how do we go from a point of capture to a point of sale?
All right, thank you. So we have some questions that are coming in, and we have one question from a panelist. She says, your talk made me think more about enslaved people on these passages who had disabilities, anything from deafness and blindness to physical and mental disabilities. And I wonder if you came across anything in your research that might have address this issue, or is this an issue that's addressed before those that are enslaved, that there's some process of selection going on here, that they may not end up on the ship?
Okay, so we're talking about sickness and enslaved people?
Yeah, and she was wondering specifically if you had come across anything that might mention if there were people that had been enslaved, but actually had disabilities of some type.
I will say that I felt like I saw more so-called disabilities on the sail side into the Americas than I saw on the African side of the coast. However, that doesn't mean that we don't see violence inflicted that would create disability, the chopping off of arms, as well as legs, different scenarios like that, that then to be sold into the trade that way. But I really kind of see it more in the arrivals, in the arrival into the Americas, and that's critical, because what I really try to convey to my students, especially, is that there is the emergence of essentially a clearance sale, where that meant that doctors, the beginning of these medical connections, and especially on the American side, it really does begin in the 18th century, that we're seeing doctors show up to be able to buy enslaved people for a 2-for-1 sale. So that meant if someone wasn't desired, viable, they couldn't really be sold in all the different places, then these doctors, they would know that there was a particular market that they could show up and be able to get even more for less. And then, of course, once owned, then you're left to whatever devices of your owners. So the sickness, I'm glad that this talk has got you to think about it even more, because we need to think about it. This is where the beginning of a broken system that is connected to the centrality of race really begins. When someone is paying to get certified to go work in an industry, to go buy and sell and essentially destroy lives, starting a broken system that professionals are really a part of. So sickness matters in a whole other way. Thank you.
And we have a couple of questions about the soundtrack, and mainly it's how can we listen to the soundtrack or purchase it?
Oh, right. Yep. So let me see if I can maybe go back. I don't know. Yeah. So if you go to 777.bandcamp.com, then you can find it there, and you can listen to it. You can, if you want to buy it, people have done that. The whole thing is making it accessible as we are remotely connected. It's one of a kind. So the other thing I do want to tell you is that it is bringing in many local musicians, and also a band that I was connected with at that time, that now thinking about drumming in its place. So it really is kind of almost taking a cue from chapter 5, where I'm talking about drumming and singing and this whole connection to these other realms. And all throughout, you have drumming. And I want to say it's let's see, Set Me Free is where there was a poem that was channeled after someone very close Victor Farwell had read the book. He had written this poem, Set Me Free. And then also you will hear me reading from the book, a little bit of a compilation from the epilogue. I believe it is an outro, or maybe it is epilogue. I'm kind of mixed up, but nonetheless, it's a real musical fusion of something never heard before. And sure to take you to the next level. I know my students are required to listen to it. I invite them to always decode the soundtrack, because again, we decode it, then we're really thinking even deeper about what am I consuming? What am I taking in? So, but thank you for that. This is the future. Maybe more academics will step into the realm of music and the production of history and herstory.
All right. All right. We have a question. Actually, this is more of a comment saying outstanding work. This should become a high school text as a must read.
Wow. Hi.
Yeah.
Okay. What they said. I agree. Wow. Who do we call? Maybe LeBron James, but
Yeah.
I agree. I agree. And if we're not ready, which we're still going to always say, should we, are we, when are we going to be ready? If we're not ready, then it's about empowering teachers at every level to begin to think about how do we translate that to the different levels that we're teaching. So it should not be in college that's the first time someone's exposed. So hopefully bookstores and libraries have it, but it's a new day. So thank you.
You know, Professor, you mentioned your students, so you must, I assume that many of your students will also want to study history and Black history. And when they come in and ask you about that, you know, what advice do you give them? They're thinking about a career as a history professor, but more specifically as a researcher and looking at Black history.
Well, yeah, it's a great question because I love students. I love to begin to help them to see their best self and then where they can fit in the future. But it really has to be about them and their gifts and their abilities. So that means I'm exposing history and herstory, but maybe it's going to help your path even more as you go on to med school. Is it maybe also going to help you thinking about law school? So what that means is really getting students to be open to where are the untold stories? What do we know? Where are the contours of that which we don't know? And what happens if we begin to move through the points of discomfort and then we find all these stories that we haven't talked about? So then we're now, really what I do over and over is I invite them to think about what is the education you received? And then even more importantly, where and how are you expanding your own understanding of whatever that it could be. But honestly, I encourage students to go as far as possible within their interests. If I'm just sort of doing a plug for a student, Dr. Lauren Henley, who now is one of the few that studies Black female serial killers. Whoa, she's at the University of Richmond. Well, because we worked together, I trained her for 4 years, and that was preparing her to go into a world thinking about the variants of the story of Black women, and also thinking about this notion, this world of crime, criminality, but violence. That's kind of a thing, because I feel like if we can go deeper into those narratives, we can know more about ourselves as a world and a society.
Professor Mustakeem, you've talked a little bit about your students, and I know just from reading some other things about you that a pivotal moment for you as far as the decision to study history and specifically Black history came with your participation at the 1997 Million Woman March. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh, wow. Okay. So we're going to dig up history.
Yeah.
Yes, I was in college. I was a sophomore, and there were two friends that we had, honestly, I'm trying to think, how did we hear about it? Because right now I'm remembering all the marketing for the Million Man March, but I actually right now can't point to exactly how we found out, but I was adamant, we're going. And all three of us, we drove up to Philadelphia. And I will say that it's interesting now standing where we are that, first of all, it's like it's forgotten. It's like it never happened. And then the numbers that are reported with how many attended really didn't match. I mean, meaning that when we were there was way more. So yet, if we don't really believe that it even happened, then of course the numbers are going to be like, are you sure that many women came? And it was powerful to be in a sea of so many Black women and just honestly so many people who were there like, yes, Black women matter and Black girls. And so this is the beginning of something that I could not recognize at that moment was going to echo so far in my future, but that would be the turning point. I mean, I was a business major and African-American studies minor because in halfway, I really didn't know what I wanted to do. And I'm like, one day I want to get a good job. But then I came back and after attending the Million Woman March, I will say that we also were teased on the way. You're going to probably get there and ha ha ha, you thought a Million Woman March was going to be here. And that frames, that also is why I teach Black women's history. I teach our only Black women's history course here at Washington University, and I do so at the level of first year, because we should have already had Black women's history within our curriculum, within our global education, and dare we say our American education. So what that means is that now when students arrive, they're like, why don't I know this? Why haven't teachers why has this not been demanded? So then we can just sort of go deeper, like, okay, let's go where we know. And then it's about more of the expansion in that way. So it's a variety of ways that I try to approach it, and also keeping up generationally with all the changes and the world changing, but more importantly, to empower students within a deeper skill set so they can be even more informed on how to go deeper and rigorous within debates, within a future of memory and all of this.
Well, I do know, piecing things together, that when you got back to Elon, that there was a minor in African-American history, Black history, but there was no major, though by the time you left, there was a major. Can you talk about how that came about?
Sure, I will actually say there still is no major. I just happened to be the first person who graduated with an independent major in African-American studies. So there was a minor. Gosh, even hearing it, there's nothing minor about African-American studies, about Blackness, about Black studies at all. And that's what I'm continuing to say, because thankfully, I am able to be in a department of African and African-American studies while also being jointly appointed within history. So there was no major. And that was because I saw a future of Blackness, even more because my mom, my dad, it was this love of Black history that came before I even got to college. But my mom would be the turning point, like, you're gonna, yep, I see what your professor's saying, you're gonna do it, and we're gonna figure it out. Because I definitely didn't know what I wanted to do. And yet I think that was what I needed. I just needed all these things to come together. But since leaving Elon in 2000, it's been interesting to see the evolution of race and Blackness, and where and how we talk about it, moving through post-racial. Really, the post-racial so-called period made me believe that no one would ever want to talk about slavery, because when people would hear what I did, oh gosh, you don't have any happy stories. So we've come a long way, but we have way far to go in a lot of this.
Well, as we're getting toward the end, if you want, can you share what you are currently working on?
Sure. I will say, by way of that trip that I had developed, where I took students across the state of Missouri several years ago, I developed a murder mystery tour. And that was really tracing a murder that I had uncovered, that a woman had committed in killing another woman. So essentially my next project is looking at both Black and white women who committed violent crimes within the 19th and early 20th century, but really sort of thinking about all kinds of connections of women and race, and all kinds of things we haven't seen before. So stay tuned. It's coming in the near future.
And my last question, thinking about the future, we've talked about your publications, and we've talked about of your work and your books. But one thing that we didn't talk about is that you also have a podcast. And I'm sure our listeners will be interested if you talk a little bit about your podcast.
Sure. And I realized that I didn't have a slide because I was trying to make sure I kept it bloody, if you will. The Book Lane 365. And it's a one of a kind with myself and Megan Ferentz, who is also an alum. She's an alum of Washington University. She was working on her PhD. We had met through my colleague, Tim Parsons, and we became good friends. And for many years, we would say, oh, you know, we should do something together. And then it, as my book has sort of taken its own evolution, we began to think about, what did I learn? And then what advice would I give to the future as she's writing her book? So we finished season 1 last year. We had about 10 episodes, and from beginning to end, we're thinking about the tools, and you're thinking about, how do you sit down and write? How do you deal with death? How do you deal with just sort of really being a scholar within a changing world? And the whole point was, in doing it, is to empower writers to see their place in finding their voice and giving to the future. So stay tuned, season 2. We're going to be doing some really exciting interviews. So thank you, Rudolph. Yes. But the Book Lane 365, and you can find it on Apple and all kinds of other spaces. But the airwaves are mattering right now. And while we're all, again, across the multiverses where we are, it is about how do we all connect. And I'm continuously coming up with new ways. And so just stay tuned to it all.
Well, this has been wonderful, and all of the comments are coming in. It's thank you, and they love your passion, and so this has just really been great for us. I will, at this point, you've given us everything. I will tell those people, the librarian coming out of me now, I know all of you out there that are in those book clubs and you're thinking, well, what should we read next? Here it is. This is what you should read. Read it and discuss it. And Professor Mustakeem is at Washington University in St. Louis, as you can find her email. So
I'm the only one in the world, Sowande Mustakeem.
That's right. So when you're arguing about points, you can email her and get the real deal.
Yep, my email is right there. So
that's right. That's our email. Thank you very much. This has been wonderful, and this is a great addition to our the library's faculty book talks. And so I just love working with you and look forward to working with you and your students in the future. And thanks to everyone that came and those that asked questions. You make this a very important endeavor for the library. So thanks to everybody, and look for emails in the future to see what other things we will be bringing you. And certainly we will be bringing you when Professor Mustakeem finishes that next work. You know, you'll be able to hear about it here at the library's faculty book talk. Good night, everybody, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.